So what do you think of when you hear the word prophet? What's the first thing that comes to your mind? If you're like most people in the world today, you think immediately of somebody who can predict the future. In fact, probably one of the greatest prophets of modern fiction has got to be Marty McFly, right? Zipping into the future in his time-traveling DeLorean and bringing back a sports almanac into the 1950s. Well, in the Bible, talking about the future is one of the things that prophets do, but it's really just a subset of the overall job description of a prophet. So in this video, we're going to take a quick look at what prophets do in the biblical text. Now, before we get into a bit of explanation about that, I recommend that you pause this video and go read Isaiah chapter 36, because some of the things that I'm going to say won't really make sense unless you have that particular chapter in mind. So go ahead and pause the video. I'll wait right here, and then you can come back and we'll continue our discussion in just a moment. So I assume you noticed that in Isaiah chapter 36 there are a number of characters who talk to one another, and those characters are going to help us get inside the Bible's vision of what a prophet is and what a prophet does. So one of those characters, the first one to make a big speech in Isaiah chapter 36, is this guy called the Rabshakeh. Rabshakeh, by the way, is not his name. Please understand that it's the Hebrew pronunciation of some Assyrian military title. Well, King Hezekiah of Judah has apparently rebelled against his overlord, King Sennacherib of Assyria, and so Sennacherib has sent this Rabshakeh character to come and make a speech to the Judeans to secure their surrender. So he says, "Thus says the great king, the king of Assyria, on whom are you relying, since you have rebelled against me," blah, 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 and makes that whole speech that you read right there at the beginning of chapter 36. Eliakim and some other Judean officials hear this speech. They interact with the Rabshakeh. Very interesting, and we'll talk about that another time. But then they go and they tell Hezekiah everything that the Rabshakeh has said. Hezekiah, the king of Judah, is distressed, and he sends Eliakim and some other people to visit the prophet Isaiah. And when Eliakim and the others come to Isaiah, they say, "Thus says Hezekiah, this is a day of distress," and so forth, and I don't need to repeat that speech because you read it for yourself in the book of Isaiah. Then Isaiah immediately says to them, "Go back and tell your master Hezekiah, thus says the Lord, everything's going to be okay." That's, of course, a very simplistic paraphrase, but you get the picture. Now, one of the interesting things is that all of these characters, the Rabshakeh, Eliakim, and Isaiah, are doing the same job for different bosses. The Rabshakeh is speaking for the king of Assyria. And so when the Rabshakeh says at the beginning of his first speech, "Upon whom do you now rely, seeing that you have rebelled against me?" The "me" in that speech is not the Rabshakeh himself, but the king of Assyria, King Sennacherib. When Isaiah says to Eliakim, "I have heard the words with which the Rabshakeh has reviled me," well, the "me" and the "I" in Isaiah's speech is not Isaiah himself, but Isaiah is speaking on behalf of his God, his deity. And Eliakim doesn't actually use first-person pronouns in his own speech, but he does use, as the Rabshakeh does, as Isaiah does, this thing called the messenger formula, "thus says," followed by the name of the person who's sending the message. So we call Isaiah a prophet, and we call Eliakim by his court title, and the Rabshakeh, we call him the Rabshakeh by his military title. But all three of these guys are doing the same job, just for different bosses. Now, messengers have two basic functions that we can see in this story. The first, of course, is to speak on behalf of someone else, and we see that very clearly in that messenger formula that I mentioned just a moment ago. But messengers also need to have the ability to think on their feet and to quickly respond to changing circumstances. You can see this in the way the Rabshakeh responds when Eliakim and the other Judean officials ask the Rabshakeh to speak in Aramaic rather than in Hebrew. Now, even though the Rabshakeh is saying thus says the great king, the king of Assyria, it doesn't seem too likely that the Rabshakeh and Sennacherib sat down during a time of war, a time when Sennacherib is off at another Judean town laying siege to it, and they sat down and they talked about, here are all the possible ways that they could respond. I mean, there's no real reason for us to think that Sennacherib thought through all these possibilities and coached the Rabshakeh on what the Rabshakeh ought to say if the Judean officials come out and said, hey, can we speak in Aramaic instead of Hebrew today? No, the king's got other business on his mind, and he delegates that kind of responsibility to the Rabshakeh. So it's the Rabshakeh's job not only to speak on behalf of the king, but to compose appropriate messages on behalf of the king. He has a commission from King Sennacherib. He doesn't necessarily have scripts from King Sennacherib. And so the messenger's job includes this compositional aspect. It's sort of like a modern-day press secretary in a sense. The President of the United States does not tell the press secretary every single answer to give that might be posed by reporters. Sometimes the President can't even anticipate all the questions that might be posed by reporters. But the President does visit with the press secretary to make sure that the message is clear. And then the press secretary has to craft appropriate statements that are consistent with his or her boss's message that they want to get across. Now this has interesting implications for the biblical prophets as well, because they're speaking, like the Rabshakeh, in someone else's name. For them it's thus says the Lord, for the Rabshakeh it's thus says the great king, the king of Assyria. But there's a great deal of stylistic differences between some of our biblical prophets. Isaiah doesn't talk like Jeremiah talks. Jeremiah doesn't talk like Hosea talks. Hosea doesn't talk like Amos talks. And these stylistic differences can best be explained by the creative resources that each prophet brings to the prophetic task. Now, all of these prophets in the Bible, the ones that have books named after them, let's say, understand themselves to be working for the same boss. But the messages that they preach have some significant differences in the use of metaphors, the use of figures of speech, the way they write their poetry, even the rhythms of their poetry, and so on. And so, on analogy with the Rabshakeh and what's clearly at work there in Isaiah chapter 36, we can anticipate that our biblical prophets understand themselves to have been given a message and given a job, but not necessarily given a script or exact words and exact images and exact metaphors that they should say. This is especially clear in the case of a prophet like Ezekiel, who has these visionary experiences which he then tries to communicate in words. It's clear that he's not being given a script, but rather being shown something more like a movie playing inside his mind, let's say. And so it's his responsibility to come up with the appropriate words that can communicate those experiences to the Judeans. And so these are the two most basic things that any messenger in the ancient world has got to do. Number one, speak in someone else's name. And number two, shape appropriate messages to fit changing circumstances.